Thank you. All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, my friend. Thank you. All right, thank you, Kent. Give me a minute to get mic'd up here. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, sounds all right. All right, I've got two mics on, and sometimes I get animated when I talk, so if I end up pulling one of them off, that's kind of just the way it goes. But first and foremost, before I get started, I want to thank Kent for the invite and for all of the hospitality that Kent and the Roundtable and you all have shown myself and my wife Michelle tonight. I think we were talking on the way up here. I do believe this is the first time I've ever been to the state of Kentucky. And I can certainly tell you it's a much warmer greeting than we get in places like Philadelphia and some other places. So very, very glad to. So anyways, let's get started. It's about 7:30. I'll probably go on for about an hour or so. I'll try not to go longer than an hour. I've got 95 years of this guy's life to cover in an hour or less. So Kent already kind of presaged my introduction here a little bit. Very much these days, like talking to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, talking to Civil War audiences about General Dan Sickles can be a dicey proposition. And I've been doing it for a long time. I think people are kind of getting what I do, but sometimes I encounter some very angry people in the audience who don't like General Sickles, and kind of to the point Kent made in the introduction, kind of can't understand why we're talking about him and why we're covering them. Now, I'm probably a little more used to talking to audiences more in the Eastern Theater. That's not to say we do get out west, but we tend to kind of talk more in the Eastern Theater. Has everybody here been to Gettysburg? Raise your hand if you've been to Gettysburg. Okay, so not everybody, but a good chunk of the audience. Has everybody here read Kent Masterson Brown's now classic book, Meet at Gettysburg? All right. Oh, well, you got some work to do there, Kent. Not every hand went up. So obviously, as a Meade historian, Kent has spent a lot of time in his book and in his work talking, among other things, about George Meade's crisis management and the crises that General Meade had to manage at the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Campaign. I'm one of those crises. Dan Sickles, one of the biggest crises. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. I'm not here to get you to like Dan Sickles. If you like him, if you don't like him, that's fine. I don't think historians should do that. They shouldn't get you to try to like their topic or that sort of thing. If I have a bias, my bias is I think it's an interesting story, and I hope you will be interested tonight. But I'm not here to get you to like him or to really kind of buy into anything on this other than the interest. But as we were kind of selling some of the books before the dinner tonight, one of the gentlemen came up and said to me, I've been to Gettysburg. I've been to Gettysburg before, and I could never really connect the dots. And then I hired a licensed battlefield guide, and this guide put it all together, and she told it like a story. And that's I think how you should do good history. Battle of Gettysburg, Gettysburg Campaign, biggest, perhaps the most important campaign of the Civil War, perhaps not, but certainly today it's the most noteworthy one, the most studied one. And every good story needs a villain. And in Sickles' case, see if my laser pointer works, okay, kind of. In Sickles' case, he had proclaimed himself as the hero of Gettysburg, one of the things we're going to talk about tonight, but really today amongst historians, scholars, Gettysburg enthusiasts, he is remembered by many as the villain of Gettysburg. And so I think if nothing else, appreciate him as the villain of the piece. Kind of a pop culture reference, if George Meade is Batman, Dan Sickles is kind of the Joker. And they kind of very much go kind of hand in hand in studying it. But beyond that, I mean, Sickles is a noteworthy Civil War figure, certainly in the Eastern Theater, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, forming the Excelsior Brigade, a congressman who had a really unusual event on his resume that we're going to talk about, early battlefield preservationist, something that you often don't think about with a lot of these guys. Just a generally colorful character. I always say, sometimes we teach Civil War history. These guys, like Robert E. Lee, like they're marble men, like they're perfect and flawless. and all of that sort of thing. I always say Dan Sickles is arguably the most relatable character of the American Civil War. I mean, throughout his entire life, he has problems with money, women, and he very often doesn't get along with his boss, right? And we can all relate to that, at least a couple of those. Again, highly influential figure in the Gettysburg story. And so with all of that, again, I think we've got a lot of phases to cover here tonight. Young Sickles, Civil War Sickles, and old man Sickles. So as I said, we got about 95 years or so to cover in the course of the hour. With that, I'm going to go through the early years relatively quickly, frankly, because there's better stuff to talk about later on. But just sort of in kind of a thumbnail sketch here, Dan Sickles, born in New York City, New York native, born in October of 1819, which would have made him just shy of his 44th birthday when he fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is a pre-war congressional image of his, one of the few images we have of him prior to the American Civil War. You know, if you were going to kind of psychologically profile the guy, he was an only child, relatively wealthy, somewhat prosperous parents. And, you know, again, if you're going to profile somebody like Sickles, I might propose that, you know, wealthier, only children tend to be a little spoiled and self-centered, right? The only child, the world kind of tends to revolve around the only child. And, you know, I think you see a little bit of that in Sickles. He was reportedly rebellious at an early age. They had trouble finding a good school for him. And sort of this self-centered aspect that you see in a lot of only children is something that he never really lost. I'm not a psychologist by trade, but that's just sort of my take on him. But the other thing, too, is because of some of the challenges he would subsequently have at the Battle of Gettysburg, he's often treated as kind of like an idiot among historians and scholars because, again, some of his battle tactical mistakes and things of that nature. But just take a moment and look at the resume. 1843, he was an attorney. 1844, he got associated with Tammany Hall politics. Everybody knows Tammany Hall, kind of the Democrat powerhouse in New York City that was famous for kickbacks and bribes and corruption and things of that nature. And he was right there. He was right part of that. New York State Assembly in 1847, Corporate Council. 1853-54, he served time in London as the secretary to future President James Buchanan, a relationship that was going to pay dividends later on. Sickles was instrumental in 1855 in the creation of New York's Central Park. Again, a little bit of a preservationist, as I talked about on the earlier slide. And when things start to kick off, finally in 1856, he was elected to Congress from his home state of New York. No real military experience, served for a couple years in the New York State militia, which really meant that he liked to call himself Colonel Sickles and wear his uniform around sometimes and, you know, march in parades like prominent men of that era would do. But he didn't really have any hardcore military experience. Let's get to the good stuff. He was involved in multiple legal actions. He was sued for theft, fraud, forgery at different times. Developed a quite involved romantic relationship with a woman in New York who was a prostitute and went on to run a well-heeled bordello in New York City. We'll talk a little bit about that. He probably served both as her client and probably at times as her pimp. How many Civil War heroes can you say that about, if nothing else? And the other thing, too, getting back to the Tammany Hall connection that, you know, I just want to make sure you appreciate, you know, politics today we think are dirty and just sleazy and underhanded, and of course they are. But in the Sickles, and you know, in the 1800s, in the Dan Sickles era in New York City, they had nothing on, you know, today they have nothing on Sickles' era. Very violent era. He was once thrown down a flight of stairs at a campaign rally. Again, and he made money. He made money. He spent money. He was a well-known womanizer. He had a lot of friends. He had a lot of enemies, as men of that type will. So the lady problems are something that, again, stayed with him throughout his life. So I've kind of formed a little love triangle here on my slide. Again, I don't know how well you can see it with the laser pointer, but if you go to the bottom left leg of the triangle, that is a New York businesswoman by the name of Jane Augusta Blankman, who actually went by the name Fanny White. And Fanny was the young lady I talked about on the previous slide. Look, not passing judgment. In an era when a woman wanted to be independent, there were only so many ways she could make a good living. And Fanny actually became a relatively successful bordello queen in New York City. Her house was frequented by Sickles and many of the Tammany Hall movers and shakers of the day, but Sickles and White seemed to have developed an actual romantic attraction for each other and a relationship, such that, again, she would often siphon off some of her funds to him, and people would often wonder, geez, on Sickles' salary, how does he always dress so well? How does he always live so well? And again, there was some thinking that Fanny might have been shoveling some funds over to him. Couple noteworthy stories associated with the Sickles-White relationship. When he was in the New York State Assembly, he decided to take her on the floor of the Assembly one day and show her around. This outraged his colleagues, so he was censured by his colleagues for doing this. Later on, when he was in New England serving with Buchanan, he reportedly introduced her to the Queen of England, kind of thing. So, which again was very scandalous, for the era. Today, they would have a reality TV show and nobody would think anything of it. But in the 1800s, this was stuff you didn't do. One day, unfortunately, Fanny got word that Sickles was also romancing this smiling young lady down here, and that is Teresa Baggioli, who was the daughter of a family friend. Now, Teresa was well-educated, came from an artistic household, was about 16 years younger than Sickles. Actually, Sickles had met her when she was 2 years old. It's kind of a little creepy if you think about that. But by the time she was a buxom and blossoming 16-year-old Catholic schoolgirl, Sickles and Teresa decided to get married. Now, why do you think a 33-year-old rising star in New York politics would marry a 16-year-old girl? She was pregnant. He got her pregnant. And Fanny was not happy about it, found out about it one day, and supposedly beat Sickles on the streets of New York with a cow whip. So Fanny was out for a little while. Teresa wins kind of the love match. And really, Fanny wasn't out of the picture because he kept seeing her after him and Teresa got married, but so what? And so in 1852, Teresa and Dan got married. They start a family. Their daughter is born. And for a little while, New York society was shocked by this a little bit, but it didn't go very far. And Sickles kind of continued on with his high-flying New York career. So again, as I said before, 1856, he's elected to Congress. Now, in those days, you're reported to start for your next term in March. So in March of 1857, he reports to Washington for his first term in Congress, right as his current mentor at the time, James Buchanan, is assuming his position in the White House. Future looks bright. What could possibly go wrong here? Well, when they get to Washington, Congressman Sickles is still seeing other women. Again, he's seeing Fanny White. He's got other affairs and dalliances going. The relationship, the marriage with Teresa is a little stormy, but they put up a good front. They get a fashionable house in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., which is situated basically right behind the White House. They have very elaborate and elegant dinner parties every night. But somewhere along the way, Teresa starts to have an affair of her own with the gentleman who was kind of in the bottom half of that picture, and that gentleman was a well-known ladies' man of his own in Washington, D.C., a district attorney by the name of Philip Barton Key, who, if you know the story, Philip Barton Key was the son of Francis Scott Key. So Key was a friend of Sickles's. He's also now messing around with Teresa. They're having their dalliances. Everybody in Washington seems to know about it except for Sickles. And then one day, February of 1859, Sickles found out about this affair. Whoops, there we go. Sickles found out about this affair and grabbed a couple of guns and shot Key dead on the streets of Washington behind the White House. So Congressman Sickles was arrested, turned himself in, and basically assembled this legal dream team assemble this legal dream team, and yes, cheap laugh here, kind of becomes what I often refer to as the O.J. Simpson of Gettysburg. The only problem with that anecdote is when you give battlefield tours now, you increasingly encounter people who don't really get the O.J. Simpson reference. So you got to stop the Civil War history and go into O.J. history, and that's just problematic sometimes. We're not going to go into the whole nuts and bolts of the murder trial tonight. I know I have many legal people in the audience. The murder trial in of itself is a fascinating story, and we could really do a whole talk about that. Maybe I could come back sometime and do Sickles, the prequel, to cover the murder trial. But the long story short on this is Congressman Sickles, with probably help from the Buchanan White House, assembles this legal dream team. It is remembered as the first successful temporary insanity defense that ever happened in U.S. judicial history. That's been overplayed a little bit. I talk about some of that in my Sickles book. But the bottom line is the dream team got Sickles acquitted, and he got off. He got off, even though he had murdered Key. He had murdered Key in broad daylight with a dozen witnesses. The dream team had gotten him off, something of a temporary insanity, crime of passion sort of defense. And at that point, public opinion was very much in Sickles' favor. The moral code of the time was such to the effect that Sickles was basically protecting his property from the adulterous Key and the adulterous Teresa. It wasn't until he briefly reconciled with Teresa after the murder trial that public opinion turned against him. And so for our intents and purposes tonight, the outcome of all of this was basically that it temporarily ended his political career. Public opinion was against him, and he decided not to run for Congress when his term of election was up. So how does any of this influence the Civil War? Well, he needed a new career. So the spring of 1861, of course, the unpleasantness starts, at Fort Sumter. Sickles, by that time, was practicing law as a private citizen in New York City. He did what an attorney, what a politician would be good at doing. He gave speeches. He raised troops. I always kind of laugh and say, if you think about it, Sickles is three things we hate all rolled up into one guy. He's a New Yorker, he's a politician, and he's an attorney, right? But those skills, at least, the present company accepted, of course. But those skills at least served him well at the beginning of the Civil War to recruit troops and give speeches. And if you want to say something nice about the guy, I do think as a Democrat, he was a committed Democrat to the Union and to preserving the country. And in a way, he felt betrayed by the Southern Democrats who, in his view, had really started the shooting and had started the war. So despite the fact that he has no West Point training, he does kind of cut a figure in the uniform here. Despite the fact that he had no West Point, no formal military training whatsoever, he raises troops. He later said he only hoped to serve as a high private, which seems kind of preposterous to think of Private Dan Sickles. But he starts out as colonel of the Excelsior Brigade. But what's going on in the White House at this time? Abraham Lincoln needs support for the unpopular war effort. And Lincoln needs the support of immigrants in different constituencies, and he needs the support of Democrats. And at some point, Sickles and Lincoln, they meet. As the story was often told, Lincoln supposedly took a liking to Sickles' fighting spirit and kind of aggressive nature and things of that sort of thing. And so over the course of the war's early years, it was Lincoln who would help promote Sickles on his rise up through the Army of the Potomac. Brigadier General by 1861, Division Command in 1862. By the time we get to 1863 and the big battles like Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, Sickles would be a major general commanding a corps. So Sickles really is in the Union Army today, at least in the Eastern Theater, kind of the poster boy for what we consider to be the political general. Right? And he owes a lot of that to Lincoln. But it's also a characteristic about Sickles that I think interests me, because he's going to go through this a few times during his life in his career, but you see this right now at this stage at the beginning of the Civil War, is that ability to reinvent himself. Some of you laughed when I kind of said, well, he needs a new career at the beginning of the Civil War, but the fact that he could take himself, who was somebody who was so down and out publicly, and transition himself into what we'll see as a war hero is kind of a pretty amazing transformation. So I wanted to talk about, since we're in Lexington, I wanted to spend a little bit, something I don't often do with this presentation, I wanted to spend a little bit just talking about Sickles and his relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln. And what Sickles in the Lincoln White House seems to pretty much have had more or less free reign of the White House during the war's early years. As I said, certainly as he's kind of ingratiating himself with Lincoln, President Lincoln, who needs him. But what you also see, too, in the literature and some of the correspondence is that Sickles and Mary Todd Lincoln seem to form quite a strong personal bond, a personal relationship of their own. And there's correspondence that still survives to the effect of, Dan, are you coming to take me to the matinee today? Kind of thing. There's people kind of snickering when, President Lincoln is away or busy, how often Dan seems to be paying social calls to Mary Todd at the White House and things of that nature. And even to the effect, and I don't necessarily believe this allegation is true, but even to the effect of, there was some snickering about maybe, Dan and Mary Todd were having their own sort of romantic liaison. I've got one of the quotes up here from a surgeon in the 154th New York who wrote in April of 1863, he's kind of in this letter, he's kind of railing against Mary Todd Lincoln, and he writes, "Perhaps I'm prejudiced against her on account of her shameless conduct and her frivolity with General Sickles. I wouldn't be surprised if old Abe has a good cause to shoot Sickles as Sickles had to shoot Key." So again, this sort of speculation, I don't personally believe it was true, but the speculation was out there, and it gives you an idea of sort of the impression that Mary and Dan were kind of giving off to the public. The other thing too, and this came up today as my wife and I were visiting the Mary Todd house right here, the Todd house right here in town. Was they had a display upstairs in the house related to Mary's half sister Emily Todd Helm. And look, you Kentuckians know a lot more about the Helms than I do. Don't bust my chops on that. I'm just trying to talk to you about the free reign that Sickles had in the White House. But I highlighted this is a photo of the display. I went back to the hotel and added it to my PowerPoint, where they talk about this story about when she was at the White House, a quote Union officer told the president that he should not have a rebel in the White House, and Lincoln replied that he and Mary could choose their own guests. Well, the Union officer they're talking about is Dan Sickles. During one of her visits to the White House, they're having dinner, and they're kind of, going back and forth, about the divided loyalties of the Todds and all of that stuff. And supposedly Sickles had gone to President Lincoln and said, Mr. President, I don't think you should have people like that visiting you in the White House. I don't think that's a good idea. And Lincoln said something to the effect of, listen, General, I'll decide, who comes to visit us. To me, with the Sickles, the Lincoln relationship, what that shows to me is, again, like I said, kind of it demonstrates this free reign in the White House where Sickles kind of thought he could just sit down and tell President Lincoln what to do. The Sickles-Lincoln relationship is an interesting one, both with Mary and with Abraham. Abraham, I think, uses Sickles more or less for the first 3 or 4 years of the war while it made good capital for Lincoln. And then in some ways, I think by the end of the war, when he didn't need Sickles anymore, he kind of threw that relationship aside. Another relationship that was noteworthy is with General Joe Hooker, who by the spring of 1863 was commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker, as y'all know, had a reputation, obviously, for womanizing and hard drinking. I don't think Hooker's drinking really influenced his command of the Army of the Potomac. Again, that's kind of a talk for another time. But he's got the reputation as a hard-partying drinker. You've got Sickles, obviously, who's got womanizing and a little bit of murder in his background. I don't think he was an alcoholic, but I do think Sickles, like the best of them, could tip a drink when he needed to. And then down at the bottom of the page, the guy with the big mustache is Dan Butterfield, who for a while had commanded the Union Army's 5th Corps, and at Gettysburg is going to be Chief of Staff for the Army of the Potomac. Butterfield's got maybe the weirdest background of the three, because when he was a youth in central New York, he apparently liked to set houses on fire and watch them burn. His father, John Butterfield, was founder of what became known as the American Express Company. So, a well-heeled family sort of thing. But, you literally have people in the Army in the winter of 1862, early spring of 1863, kind of aghast that what they said was, that this trio of drunk, murderer, and arsonist for a while seemed to be running the Army of the Potomac. And if you've ever read the diaries from this period, some of the letters, some of the correspondence, when the Army of the Potomac was in winter quarters, what you see in this period is basically they seem to be having a lot of parties in winter quarters, and even in central Virginia in the dead of winter, these three guys seem to find women, and so so you see it in these letters. We attended a party last night. Where does General Hooker find all these women? General Sickles had a New Year's party. We were drinking, the rum and the champagne was flowing, and there were women everywhere, kind of thing. And this seems to go on kind of in the early months of 1863, prior to the spring campaigning. Unfortunately, the one guy who was kind of excluded from that social circle was Kent's guy, George Gordon Meade. Very different in terms of personalities. God loved George Meade. He's a dedicated soldier, a good, solid family man. But to be honest, if you wanted to have a good time on Saturday night, you'd be hanging out with these guys instead. And for a variety of reasons, which I go into in my Sickles book, Meade is excluded from this social circle. There's a lot of things going on. The personalities are different. There's a dispute that erupts in the Army after the battle at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. That causes some problems where Meade kind of becomes unpopular in the Union Army's 3rd Corps. There's going to be a dispute after the Union defeat at Chancellorsville over whether or not Hooker and the Army had wanted to retreat. They get into a dispute about that. And so you've got these personality conflicts in addition to the professional differences of the West Pointers versus the non-West Pointers. And so there's a lot of these cliques, which I find fascinating. There's a lot of these cliques, a lot of these factions sort of forming in the Army of the Potomac. Sometimes I liken it to, the school cafeteria, where you have the cool kids table over here, maybe you have the nerds over here kind of thing. And, Meade was kind of sitting at the nerd table for a little while. And there's a lot of letters where he attests to this. He writes one to his wife, where he says, "Such gentlemen as Dan Sickles and Dan Butterfield are not the types of persons that I should select as my intimates," sort of thing. And so Meade is, I think, a little wounded by the fact that they're having all this fun and games and he's not part of it. Unfortunately for Sickles, who I think, again, being politically astute, is a pretty good butt kisser in terms of aligning himself with people above him. I could use a stronger word, but y'all know what I mean by butt kisser. Sickles kind of misses the boat on Meade. And so George Meade, put in command of the Army of the Potomac, June 28, 1863, 3 or 4 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. When Meade is put in command of the Army of the Potomac, really for the first time in his military career, Dan Sickles is on the outs at headquarters. He doesn't have, his buddy Joe Hooker isn't there anymore. He didn't even have a guy in charge who likes him at this point. You got these two guys who don't like each other. They don't communicate well. They don't work well together. And I think the ensuing controversy at Gettysburg, I think more than anything, is in modern terms a simple failure to communicate. So We're not going to do a whole lot of battle by PowerPoint tonight, but I do want to kind of just give you a general sense. July 2nd, 1863. What we know today is the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, if you see on my map here, we've got basically what looks like, try and get my pointer over there, an upside down J on my map, the famous Union fishhook defense that General Meade is going to kind of put in position at Gettysburg. So up on the right of the J, you've got Culp's Hill, kind of work your way down the J, and at the lower end, near the bottom, would be the Union Army's left flank, positioned at an area today that we know as Little Round Top. Sometime during the morning hours of July 2nd, General Meade gave Sickles verbal orders to basically put your troops on that range of hills, on the round tops, if practicable to occupy it. And during the course of the morning of the 2nd into the early afternoon, while Confederate preparations for the attack were also underway, General Sickles decided he didn't really like the position that Meade had assigned to him. And what Sickles felt like, which is represented on my map, you kind of see like some blue arrows kind of shooting out to a line out there. Let me see. Yeah, I think I'm losing the laser pointer. You kind of see some blue arrows shifting out to an advanced position in front of the fishhook. What happened was General Sickles decided that he was going to move his troops forward into an advanced position and basically break up General Meade's interior lines from the fishhook. And so Sickles anchored a position along what is known today as the Emmitsburg Road, an area of the battlefield that we call the Peach Orchard, such that when Longstreet and Lee finally launched their attack at about 4 in the afternoon on the second day, Longstreet basically slammed into this advanced position that was in front of the main line. Now, it is considered, if not one of the greatest controversies of the Civil War's Eastern Theater, certainly one of the greatest controversies at the Battle of Gettysburg. Why did Sickles move forward at Gettysburg? Was he right? Was he wrong when he moved forward? Well, what do we say about Sickles? He's a New Yorker, he's a politician, he's an attorney. Guys like that like to talk, right? And in the ensuing aftermath of the battle, Sickles gave a lot of reasons why he moved forward. Some of them make sense, some of them don't. He claimed, for example, that he was confused, uncertain by the verbal nature of General Meade's orders. He claimed that some of the low ground north of Little Round Top was rocky, rugged, and indefensible. Sickles also claimed he lacked the manpower to cover Meade's line. But most sinisterly, Sickles later claimed that he had advanced to prevent Meade from retreating. Sickles concocted a story that George Meade had basically wanted to retreat from the battlefield at Gettysburg, and that Sickles moved forward to prevent General Meade from retreating. And when, one thing led to the other, and the Union Army won the Battle of Gettysburg, who should you credit with the victory? Not George Meade, but Dan Sickles. So it was kind of an elaborate spin campaign. Some of the elements, as I said, hang together. Some of them don't. But during the course of the battle itself, Sickles' position ultimately came under heavy attack by James Longstreet, William Barksdale, some of the other Confederates in the Confederate Army First Corps. Sickles' advanced line came under heavy assault, and probably at about 6 o'clock or so in the evening on July 2nd, an infantry assault led by William Barksdale's Mississippians basically hit Sickles' advanced line right at the Peach Orchard, cracked that line open, and sent Sickles' troops streaming back to Cemetery Ridge with heavy losses. Fortunately, and this is the crisis management that Kent talked about in his book, fortunately Meade, during the interval, had brought in a lot of reinforcements to try to shore up, patch up the position, and really try to plug a lot of the holes that Sickles had created by moving forward. There's always been kind of a school of thought that the Sickles maneuver at Gettysburg nearly came to losing the battle for the Union Army. That is still the opinion today held by most serious historians. I'm not here to argue or try to dissuade you from that, but I will say by moving into an advanced position, Sickles intentionally or inadvertently, also created heavy casualties in Longstreet's corps in the Army of Northern Virginia, such that by capturing the Peach Orchard, fighting through the wheat field, capturing Devil's Den, Sickles really helped create a lot of casualties for the Confederates as the Confederates fought for positions that were ultimately meaningless to them in winning the Battle of Gettysburg. So there's very much kind of a before and after on this, as we kind of debate the merits of the position. But from Sickles' point of view, late in the action, as he was trying to rally some of his crumbling battle lines, an incoming Confederate round came in and struck him in the right leg. Well, Sickles was carried off the battlefield. Some accounts say theatrically smoking a cigar to kind of rally his troops. He was carried to a field hospital where his shattered leg was amputated that night. And you probably guessed this is General Sickles' severed leg. One of the things he did was he donated the leg to a fledgling medical museum in Washington. And one of the stories is, he possibly apocryphal, but that he would go visit his severed leg each year on the anniversary of the battle. Maybe, maybe not. Other stories more dramatically, when he had a woman in Washington that he wanted to impress, he would go show her the leg. Kind of maybe not kind of thing. But a couple things that we do know kind of happen here. As he's carried off the battlefield, July 3rd, July 4th, he ends up in Washington, D.C. As he's recuperating in Washington, D.C. during those early days of July 1863, you can imagine Lincoln was frantic to hear from anybody who had been on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And of course, his old friend, General Sickles, is in town, so it was natural that Lincoln would go visit Sickles. Probably the first guest that Sickles received while he was recuperating was Lincoln. And so, as the story goes, with Sickles, Lincoln, kind of the first audiences playing off each other, Sickles was able to start, quote unquote, getting his side of the story into Lincoln's head. And this probably included, as I said before, this idea that newly promoted General Meade was weak and timid and indecisive. And, I fought the fight, to prevent this weak guy from retreating. Kind of starts the story that lingered for many, many years, preventing Meade from getting credit for the Battle of Gettysburg. The other piece of this, though, which is to me equally as interesting, as Sickles will now once again reinvent himself for kind of maybe the last phase of his life as a war hero. And he would, now become a popular speaker at veterans reunions in the aftermath, gatherings, we'll talk about monument dedications and things like that, but very often not learn to walk on an artificial leg, very often getting up in front of these groups and saying, well, excuse me if I don't stand, but I lost a leg for you at the Battle of Gettysburg kind of thing. And that was the kind of thing that veterans audiences loved and they kind of ate up. And he used that. He played on that for the rest of his life to, like I say, kind of make himself into a war hero. Very late in life, he lived across the street from Mark Twain. And Mark Twain got to know Sickles a little bit. They had a meeting one night. And I think Twain summarizes it better than I or probably anybody else could. But about this meeting and about his relationship with Sickles, Twain wrote, quote, General Sickles values the leg he's lost much more than the one he's got. And if he has to part with one, I'm sure he would rather lose the one he still has. Which again, I think summarizes it pretty well in terms of how Sickles played on this. And he would do it again for the remainder of his life. Now in the spring of '64, Sickles is again looking for something to do. In October of 1863, he had tried to come back to the Army of the Potomac, and General Meade had refused his re-entry. And I want to think about that for a minute. Think about the recuperative powers that are at play there. I mean, your leg is amputated, severed, smashed on a battlefield in July of 1863. By October, 3 months later, he's hosting dinner parties in New York and he's ready to come back to the Army. But what do you think General Meade said? Right? So Meade found an excuse and said, well, I don't really think your health is where it should be. Declines Sickles' generous invitation to come back to the Army. And without that, Sickles was now a general without a command, which gave him more time to hang out in Washington, which is what you don't want guys like Sickles doing. You don't want them hanging out in Washington. And so combined with that, there was some criticism, rather mild criticism, General Meade made against Sickles in his own report of the Gettysburg campaign, but essentially accused Sickles of not fully apprehending the instructions that had been given to him on July 2nd, kind of put Sickles into attack mode against General Meade. And so in the spring of 1864, when the Joint Committee of the Conduct of the War started taking testimony related to the Gettysburg campaign, the radical Republicans running the Joint Committee kind of decided they didn't really like George Meade. And they started looking for people to testify who could essentially testify against Meade. So you got Sickles creating this story that Meade didn't want to fight at Gettysburg. You've got the radical Republicans looking for anybody who's got dirt on Meade, and it sort of became, again, a great political marriage. And Sickles, along with a few other Union generals, cooperated in testifying against Meade before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And for the most part, Sickles testified, that my move forward was not through any misinterpretation of orders. It was either a good line or a bad line. I took it on my own responsibility. I took up that line because it enabled me to hold commanding ground. But unfortunately, under oath, he also lied about it too at times, saying that I succeeded in getting in a position on Round Top, and I defended those positions to the end. And we know today he didn't get on to Little Round Top. He was lying about it or that sort of thing. But it was a very damaging sort of thing for the Gettysburg historiography, which is something that for many years, and maybe even still today, Gettysburg historians have been trying to sort out. And this is one of the reasons why so many Gettysburg books are written, because you got so many different facets to the story. Well, George Meade arrived in Washington. He was summoned to testify before the Joint Committee too, and he was astonished, thinking maybe he'd be celebrated as the winner of the Battle of Gettysburg. He was astonished to instead find out that the committee and some of his own generals were going there in secret and testifying against him. And Meade now had to go quickly on the defense against Sickles and some of his other critics to try to prove that a lot of these accusations were false. Meade had written at one point that these are false and perverted statements which have astonished even myself. Meade later wrote that Sickles' own movement basically produced about 2/3 of my losses for the entire battle. If this is an advantage to be so crippled in battle without attaining an object, I must confess I cannot see it. So Meade was pretty good at defending himself, had to testify, the accusations, the mudslinging, all of this was now going back and forth between Sickles partisans, between Meade partisans, and really these guys tried to fight over who deserved credit for winning the Battle of Gettysburg for as long as they lived. Sickles, though, unfortunately, got a little bit of an advantage over Meade because Meade dies in 1872. Right? And Sickles, as we'll see, is going to go on for much, much longer than that. But initially, after the war ended, initially people were kind of focused with getting on with their lives. Sickles took a political appointment in the late 1860s. He was the minister of Spain for a couple of years. Now, if you know anything about Sickles' temperament, being a diplomat, not the right job description for this guy. He almost started a war with Spain a decade or two before the real Spanish-American War happened. Finally, he ran afoul of the White House, and somebody said, "Okay, kind of get Sickles out of here. Let's kind of dispense with him a little bit." So he spent a couple years kind of living large in Spain, and then he goes on to France. While he was in Spain, there was at least one accusation, one complaint filed against the Secretary of State that he was running a child prostitution ring. Not really sure what became of that. But more famously, More famously, while he was in Paris, he started a romance with the lovely young lady at the top left-hand side of the screen. I have him, of course, talking about the deposed Queen Isabella of Spain. And so Sickles started to romance Queen Isabella. As you can see, he obviously has a thing for the brunettes, I guess. But while he was romancing Queen Isabella, he also fell for one of what at the time would have been one of her 20-something attendants, a young lady by the name of Caroline de Cray, who is at the bottom of the screen. Now that is a picture of her taken later in life. I will acknowledge it when she was in her 20s, when Sickles probably laid his eyes on her. She was quite more attractive than that. But the interesting thing with Sickles and Caroline is the story went is they both started connecting with each other because each one thought the other person had money. He thought she had money, she thought he had money. So they got married, and it turned out at that time nobody had money. And they were as it was described, they were temperamentally unsuited to each other and pretty much spent the whole time arguing and fighting and all of that stuff. One of the things, though, which came back into play later, Sickles by this time is in his mid to late 50s. He's got one leg. I mean, he's got a serious war wound. He fathered 2 children with her. So yay, Dan Sickles, right? But again, a boy and a girl. But they don't really get along with each other, as I said. So at the end of the 1870s, Sickles says, you know what? I'm tired of Europe. I'm going back home to New York. And left his wife and 2 children in Europe. So, not a great story there. And if I didn't mention it, I probably didn't mention it. His first wife, Teresa, had died in 1867 of what is probably tuberculosis, which, from Sickles' position, put him on the market again, which is one of the reasons why he was free to get married for the second time. But he comes back home to New York in the late 1870s. And, as I said, Meade had died in 1872. In 1886, Sickles was appointed chairman of the New York Monuments Commission for the battlefield of Gettysburg. This was an important role. This was him in the battlefield, him in the middle shortly thereafter with a couple of generals who fought under his command at Gettysburg. But it was an important role here at the New York Monuments Commission because basically their role was to approve New York monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield, and there's a lot of them, approve the placement of New York monuments, approve New York's version of the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. So it was an important thing. And, obviously as part of this, you're going to attend, as I said before, a lot of veterans reunions, monument dedications, and things of that nature. The veterans loved him. He'd get up there. He's a good speech maker. If the audience needed a perk a little bit, he had cigars, he had whiskey. He might buy you some women if you needed it, sort of thing. So again, he knew how to play to the veterans crowds. They loved it. He was a popular speaker for really the rest of his life. And what did he do? He would often return to his favorite theme of George Meade didn't want to fight at Gettysburg. Me and my boys, we won the Battle of Gettysburg. And again, although Meade still had friends around who could defend him, Meade was not around to be able to do that. 1895, well, in the 1890s, he gets reelected to Congress from New York. So think about that. You left Congress in the 1850s, hot on the heels of a big scandalous murder trial. 1890s, he gets reelected to Congress, and one of the things that he does, really the only notable thing that he ever did in his congressional career, besides killing Philip Barton Key, was in 1895, Sickles formally introduced the legislation that created Gettysburg National Military Park. So very much so, you could in some ways, at least symbolically, consider him the father of the National Military Park that we all have and that we all enjoy today. So it's not all bad with Sickles. I mean, there's some noteworthy stuff there. Another thing that's of note, too, during this period is he struck up a friendship with Confederate General James Longstreet. Now, it was very much Longstreet who had butted heads with Sickles in the fight for the Union left, July 2nd at Gettysburg. As you all know probably, Longstreet had very much his own post-war difficulties with the Lost Cause and things of that nature. So Longstreet was controversial. His performance at Gettysburg was controversial. Obviously, Sickles's was. And the two developed what I think was a legitimate friendship as they both supported and defended each other's actions at Gettysburg. And there's a great story. I mean, there's a couple of great stories associated with it. Probably my famous is 1890s Atlanta. They've been out drinking all day for St. Patrick's Day. I know we just had St. Patrick's Day. So they've been out drinking all day. They're kind of hobbling back to the hotel at the end of this day of drinking. And at one point, Sickles says to Longstreet, you know, Longstreet, one of these days you should apologize for shooting my leg off. And Longstreet allegedly replies, apologize, you should thank me for leaving you one leg to stand on. So, you know, they kind of had this, you know, this banter and would kind of go back and forth with that. But from a military perspective, for the remainder of his life, Longstreet insisted that Sickles's move, Sickles's advance to the Peach Orchard at the Battle of Gettysburg, Longstreet insisted that Sickles's advance had actually won the battle for the Union cause. Now, did he believe it? Did he not believe it? Was he just supporting his drinking buddy? Did he really believe it? I mean, that's part of what we try to sort through and figure out. 1902, shortly before he died, Longstreet wrote, quote, I believe it is now conceded that the advanced position at the Peach Orchard taken by your corps under your orders saved that battlefield to the Union cause. And here they are at what is probably the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. There's Longstreet, there's Sickles, there's Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine, kind of hanging out with them, a number of veterans, a couple other prominent generals in there. But as I said, Longstreet went to his grave supporting Sickles. Did he believe him? You know, is it as, you know, historians today, you know, basically think Sickles nearly lost the battle, but you had guys like Longstreet who had fought and who had been there and said that that wasn't necessarily the case. Okay, which brings us now to nearly the end. It's now 1913. 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. This Meade Sickles, Lee Longstreet, Longstreet Sickles, this stuff's been going on now for 50 years. And of course, progressively, the veterans are dying out. Well, only the good die young, right? Because here we are at the 50th anniversary and Dan Sickles is still alive and kicking. And there he is in the center. Now, the woman to what would be his left or our right was his housekeeper, a woman by the name of Eleanor Wilmerding, who, among other things, seems to be kind of siphoning money from him. They may or may not be having a romantic relationship. You know, historians still kind of quibble about that. But in the early 1890s, Sickles' father had died, and Sickles had inherited about $6 million. Yeah, which, you know, $6 million in the 1890s is a pretty good chunk of change. By 1912 or 1930, he's blown through all of it, and he's bankrupt. And he's pretty much spending it on women, spending on stuff and that sort of thing. His house, you know, some of his houses were in foreclosure, stuff like that. Perhaps more seriously, the state auditor for New York State decides he's going to do an audit of the New York Monuments Commission's books. And they find 28 grand is unaccounted for. Well, Chairman Sickles, who by this time is 93, 94 years old, clearly failing mentally, physically, Chairman Sickles, you know, he doesn't have any receipts. Sorry, I don't have any receipts. And they consider throwing him in jail. So once again, you know, 60 years after he'd murdered Philip Barton Key, once again he's looking at jail time. Well, once again, his attorney and some friends came through for him and kind of got him off the hook. James Longstreet's widow promised him some money and things of that nature. So they got him off the hook. He didn't go to jail. He was kind of embarrassingly deposed from the New York Monuments Commission. Meanwhile, wife number 2 and his adult son come back from Europe, say, Dad, we're home. You know, they want to reconcile. But Sickles and the housekeeper got something going on, and they won't let wife number 2 and the son back in the house. The wife number 2 pawns some of her jewelry to kind of smooth things over. And he's like, well, that's great, but you're still not getting into the house kind of thing. So all of this is playing out in the New York newspapers. And, just like the Key murder had been a great scandal and Sickles' performance at Gettysburg had been in the newspapers for so many years, all of this was still in the newspapers. But he comes to Gettysburg one last time. Again, 50th anniversary. Miss Wilmerding, the housekeeper, comes with him. And he was, in fact, treated like a celebrity. Cheering veterans. Everybody wanted to come out, see old General Sickles. There were a couple guys, who had either fought under him or had like lost a brother or something under Sickles. Not everybody was on the Sickles train, but for the most part, he was treated as a celebrity. It was allegedly at this anniversary that a friend took him around the battlefield. With all the stuff he had been involved with, there was, and to this day still is not, a Sickles statue on the Gettysburg battlefield. A friend took him around and supposedly said, General Sickles, what do you think about there not being a monument to you on the battlefield? He allegedly looked around and said, don't worry about it. The whole damn battlefield is my monument. And again, happened, didn't happen. Kind of like the man who shot Liberty Valance. If it didn't happen that way, it should have. I think that's what movie that line's from, I think, right? So anyways, he did unfortunately die shortly thereafter. Spring of 1914, he back home in New York, he died of cerebral hemorrhage. There's kind of a quote here. Again, we talked a little bit at the beginning about how despised he is as a historical figure. Anonymous guy on the internet once said that, quote, Sickles was so despised that no one attended his funeral. He died alone. Nobody there to commemorate him. Folks, this is a picture of General Sickles' funeral. All right? I forget what street that is in New York. The Flatiron Building is I think this one over here. I'm pretty sure there's more than a couple people at that funeral. Right or wrong, he got a hero's send-off. He got a military funeral, which was really for the last phase of his life, how he wanted to be remembered. Not as an attorney, not as a congressman, not as a Tammany Hall guy. He wanted to be remembered as a Civil War general, and he got that with the military send-off at his funeral. I think the New York Times in their obituary summarized it well. Among other things, it was a lengthy obituary, but among other things, they said, nobody with warm blood flowing through his veins can read the obituary of General Sickles without a certain thrill of admiration. As it was, I heard some people snicker at admiration. As it was, he filled many important positions in the civil and military life and was always conspicuous in the minds of his contemporaries. Right? It's kind of like a backhanded kind of, well, what do you think of him? Well, he was conspicuous, right? I guess kind of it. There was some talk about burying him in Gettysburg's National Cemetery, but eventually his attorney came forward and said no, he wanted to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which is where he's buried today. And so the legacy, so you kind of come back and you say, well, okay, why should I care? If I'm a Civil War enthusiast, if I'm a Gettysburg enthusiast, you really haven't told me anything likable about this guy. I could argue he's a lovable rogue kind of thing, but that's sort of up to you and your own personal sort of preferences there. But why should I care about this guy? And this is the legacy, because he's important in understanding the Gettysburg story. The Gettysburg story is seminal to understanding the Civil War story, and it kind of all comes together. Let me recap. He established Gettysburg National Military Park. Much of the battlefield as we know it today, occurred because of the way he fought the battle. Whether you think his move forward to the Peach Orchard, to Devil's Den and the wheat field, whether you think that helped or hurt, his move forward dictated how the Battle of Gettysburg was going to be fought. Under his leadership, even though, we never found the 28 grand, New York placed 88 monuments on the battlefield and in the National Cemetery, and very much, again, much of the preserved nature of the Gettysburg National Military Park we owe to him. So you put it all together, the influence on the battle, the influence on the historiography, and his influence on the battlefield itself in the preservation era. Really, in my opinion, if it doesn't make him Gettysburg's most influential figure, I would argue even more so than George Meade or Robert E. Lee, if it doesn't make him the most influential figure, he's got to be at the top of the heap for that. So, the whole damn battlefield might not be his monument, but I do think he certainly has his share of it. Well, okay, so we're back to this guy again. So, when Sickles would talk to the veterans, and he'd kind of get up there and say, well, how long do you want me to talk? And they would pound on the table and say, all night. Now, that woke a few people up. All night. Well, of course, I don't have all night, but I have come in right at an hour like I promised. So, as I said at the outset, don't need you to like Dan Sickles. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you can appreciate the story. Maybe you do agree or disagree as far as his importance. But again, they sure don't make him like him anymore. Somebody once told me he's like a real live episode of House of Cards, which, might be true. House of Cards Civil War edition, I guess, would be how we would put that. But, I do have books tonight. We'll talk about my Sickles book, which covers a lot of this, my Peach Orchard book, which again includes Sickles, or Pickett's Charge. I also want to mention, too, real quick, I'm also co-host of the free Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. And I call it out tonight because one of our most popular episodes was a special two-parter that we did with your very own Kent Masterson Brown, which is free not only on any podcast of your choice, but also on YouTube. So tune into the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, and you can see Kent and I bantering about Meade Sickles. Okay, so with that, I know I'm out of time. Like I said, I came in about an hour like I promised. Any questions before we move on? So, and thank you for your time, and again, all the courtesy you've shown us. So thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, if anybody have questions, I'll help you.
Okay. Okay.
I have one. You mentioned that Sickles murdered Francis Scott Key's son.
Yes.
Francis Scott Key's granddaughter lived in Lexington and was the father of John Hunt Morgan's cousin that won the Nobel Prize, Dr. Morgan. Was that this victim's daughter, or do you know?
I don't know. The Keys, especially some of us are from Maryland, the key tentacles spread long and wide. I don't recall ever hearing about one of Philip Barton's daughters. I forget, he had several kids. I don't recall ever hearing about one of the daughters being related to that connection. So I don't think so, but I'm not positive on that. We might have to look that one up. Anything else?
Other questions?
Else?
Okay, yeah,
Oh,
Chris.
yes, sir.
So, Sickles had no formal military training at all, and he became a brigadier general.
He became a major general, even better. Yeah. So you look at that, right? So again, being more of an Eastern theater guy, you look at that and you say, gee, it's no surprise why, at least up until mid-1863, why is the Union Army in the Eastern Theater having such a difficult time? And in a lot of ways, it was pre-Grant, it was because the Union Army, was beholden to Congress, it was beholden to the White House, the newspapers, the political appointments, and things like that. Now, Sickles is kind of the extreme example of that, the poster boy for the political general. Certainly at Gettysburg, he was the highest ranking non-West Pointer in the Army. And I think one of the good things that Grant does, when Grant comes east in 64 and 65, I don't know how you feel about it, but I think one of the good things that Grant does in 64, 65 is, in a way, he can kind of put a stop to some of that. That's not to say Grant doesn't have his own political pressures and things of that, but you don't see formerly temporarily insane congressman running Corps in the Army of the Potomac under Grant. So, but yeah, it's a good point. Anything else?
Well,
All right.
thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to unmic here. Give me a second. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.